signature program that introduces students in Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders communities to public service. And our goal is to inform and inspire students to take their own action and to continuously engage in the civic engagement work. Excitingly, the series this year, the theme is Moving Forward, which highlights prominent issues affecting the entire nation through an AANHPI lens, as well as providing you, the attendees, with actionable items and key takeaways to affect change for yourself and for others. Before we start, I want to recognize for a second that we're all facing tremendous challenges right now, whether it's the trauma inflicted on Black communities and communities of color during COVID, before it and beyond, and the grief and disorientation of the current pandemic. Being physically and mentally exhausted is understandable. So we thank you for taking the time to attend our program and to join in this community effort. For some of us, this hour may be the typical time of a meal with your family. You're taking a break from the day. That's totally fine. Feel free to watch with your family, bring those loved ones in, and do what you need to take care of yourself during the session. We just ask that you're here and you know, you're able to learn from us. And so we recognize also that it may be a little challenging to focus during these times. So it's our hope that we can engage you for the length of this programming and really provide a safe space for you to share your thoughts and questions, especially with our talented panelists today. I should also mention that there will be a short survey that will pop up after we close the session. And so we'd greatly appreciate you just take a minute when the panel is over, before running off to do what you need to do, fill out that survey. Let us know how we can continuously improve our programming. It is so important for us. And that said, let us begin. And so, hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of 2020 Washington Leadership Program. This session is entitled COVID-19, Present and Future for Asian America. Yes. My name is Billy Lim, and I'll be your host for the event this evening. This session will focus on providing space for education and comfort for the effects of COVID-19. Key topics of discussion include mental health, physical health, and building strength by learning tactics to either de-escalate or resolve potential conflicts created by the xenophobia we are witnessing in our everyday lives and in our communities. I want to thank our speakers and panelists today for spending their time with us, and to all of you for joining in. And a very special thank you to Act to Change, who is sponsoring tonight's session, as well as to the Mayor's Office in DC on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs for being our partner and a strong supporter of this program. Tonight's program will consist of a mindfulness activity, so a really nice way to wind down and get yourself into a good space mentally, as well as a panel discussion and Q&A. Please submit any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we will close out today with an ancient Hawaiian prayer. It is now my pleasure to introduce Rahul, one of the panelists, who will set the stage for our panel with a mindfulness activity. Rahul Kulkarni is the CEO of Suki. Suki is an online platform that aims at building a bridge between mental wellness and cultural understanding. Hi, Rahul.
Hey, Billy, thank you for that introduction. Okay, well, to start us off, I'm going to do about 5 minutes of just a mindfulness 101. So kind of learning what the basics of mindfulness are, and then we are going to spend about 10 minutes actually going through a mindfulness exercise, really trying to experience it and set the tone for the rest of the panel and the discussion. And so, to begin, let's see if I can do this flawlessly. I am going to first share my screen, and then I am going to put this in presentation mode. Okay, I'm assuming that looks all right. So just to introduce myself, all right, I got the thumbs up from Anna, I think I'm okay. My company is called Suki, which is Sanskrit, which is an ancient Asian language, and it means the word happy. And essentially what we do is corporate mindfulness as well as culturally sensitive mental wellness. And just to start, I wanted to talk about some of the feelings that we might all be feeling right now. And one of the Harvard Business Review, one of their writers said, that collective feeling that we're all feeling is actually called grief. And we're so used to it being in a setting where we have lost a loved one or something that we really cared about, not necessarily this type of grief, which is anticipatory grief. It's the grief of losing your normalcy, at the same time not knowing what's going to come next. And so this is really an unprecedented situation, having this global pandemic, and it puts us in this sense of collective vulnerability. And so some of the things that we are all experiencing right now are social isolation. So being separated from the people we care and we love, the health effects of the actual pandemic itself. So I heard the other day that the US is over 100,000 deaths, 1,000 people a day dying. It's really heavy, and dealing with that sense of loss and that morbidity, as well as we have the economic loss, job stability. People are losing their jobs. They don't know when they're going to get new ones. And people are fearful of whether or not their jobs that they already have are stable. And finally, there's just this general ambiguity of all of it. What does phase one look like? What is phase two? How do we re-enter the world right now? Can I go to a bar? Can I go to a restaurant? Do I wear a mask? Do I don't? There's so much unknown, so many things unknown about what's going on right now. And when you sum it all together, it culminates in this kind of visceral sense of collective grief. So I want to talk a little bit about mindfulness. Oh, that one went fast, as a solution. And not just the solution, just one of many ways that you can use to help yourself. And so the first thing I thought was, well, why don't we start on defining what mindfulness is versus what it's not? Because there's a lot of misconceptions about what it is. And so I define it as the moment-to-moment awareness of the present. And so there was a study done recently, and it said that about half the time, about 47% of the time, we're thinking about something else than what we're actually doing. It's one of those things where if you're doing something, you're working on autopilot, and sometimes time can lapse and you didn't even realize what you were doing. So mindfulness is about being present. It's about being completely lost in that present moment and not being anxious about thoughts about the future, as well as not dwelling on things that have happened in the past. And so that's what it is. It's the selective focus on an object. And so this can be a selective focus on a feeling. And feelings really are that you feel them. They're visceral reactions to emotions in your body. It can be focused on a behavior like mindfulness walking, a thought, or a sensation. And it can be an effective aid for anxiety, for depression, and attention. And I bolded aid because I want to make sure that this is not a substitute for other types of care, whether it's medication or whether it's doing other things that bring you joy. Mindfulness is one of the many things that you can do as part of your wellness routine. And it can be done anywhere. A lot of times I see this mindfulness imagery of someone, cross-legged on top of a waterfall. Everything looks beautiful. It doesn't have to just be in the middle of the Amazon. It can be on your morning commute. It can be in your bedroom. It can be eating dinner with your family. It can be done anywhere. It's not always seated. It's just a way to operate in the world, which is like an added sense of presence to what you're doing. It's really about selective attention. And it's becoming increasingly common as a way to kind of deal with the stresses of everyday life. Right now, over a third of US employers are now offering mindfulness training in some variation. So this was very much something on the fringe just a few years ago. And now things like Headspace and Calm and meditation apps and trainings are now becoming very much involved in the way that we operate in the real world. So things that it's not. So mindfulness and meditation, a lot of times those terms get thrown around alternatively. And the thing is, it's kind of a square and a rectangle analogy. So mindfulness is a type of meditation. Just like breathing exercises, yoga, visualizing something and thinking about that vision, those are all types of meditation as well. Another thing that it's not is clearing your mind or emptying your mind. You might think, oh, I want to do mindfulness because then I can clear all these thoughts that are going on all the time in my head. That's not what mindfulness is. I think it would be impossible to clear your thoughts. We have no control on whether thoughts come or go, but what we do have control about is how we react to those thoughts. And so mindfulness is about letting thoughts happen, noticing them, and not either clinging or going away from them. It's a non-judgmental observation of the thoughts in our mind. Another thing is, a lot of people think that because stress is so often related to mindfulness, that this is a relaxation technique. This is like going to get a massage or something like that. And it can be relaxing. Hopefully today's session will be relaxing, but at the same time, it's not always. And some thoughts may arise during mindfulness techniques that are uncomfortable, and that's totally okay. Again, it's about redirecting our attention and learning how to cope and deal with thoughts as they come along. It's not part of a religion. And so some people might think that it has religious backings because it is often tied with Buddhism. Although Buddhism is an ancient religion that utilizes mindfulness practices, the practices themselves are very secular. And so you can feel free to bring this into a work atmosphere or bring this into any setting. It doesn't have a spiritual component to it. It's largely, again, focused on observing your breath and your thoughts itself. And finally, it's not easy. Mindfulness is definitely a muscle that you're building, just like any other muscle in your body. And just if you went to the gym once, you're not going to leave looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Here is the same thing, just with your brain. That's the muscle, your mind. That's the muscle you're building, and it can be frustrating. You can lose your thoughts, your kind of sense of focus a lot, and it's a constant yo-yo of being in the pocket and then kind of losing your thoughts and then coming back. So it's definitely not easy. But so let's talk a little bit about how it helps. And so one thing to note is that there's actually been a lot of really good clinically validated science behind mindfulness. So even though it is in this kind of feel-good space, and you see it involved in a lot of wellness circles, it's actually very much scientifically backed. And just in the corporate setting alone, there's been a lot of studies that show that it can actually lower levels of burnout as well as perceived stress. It increases focus as well as creativity. It improves cooperation and compassion. So it actually can lead to empathy building, things like that. And overall, it strengthens your psychological well-being. So you can have some pretty significant kind of benefits from it. And my favorite definition of mindfulness is so simple. It's simply going from autopilot to being aware. And with that, I am going to start our mindfulness workshop. And to do that, the first thing I'm going to ask everyone to do that's on this call is three things. Well, one, it sounds like everyone's already on mute, so that's already done. But the other one is I'm going to turn off my video because I really want you to focus on just my voice. We do a lot of corporate mindfulness workshops, and we found that really helps people and just grounds them, just the sound of my voice, rather than focus on me saying it. And another thing is, if you do have headphones, this is a great time for you to kind of just plug in your headphones. And so you can really just hear us really quick, right next to your ears. So with that, I'm just going to pause for a second, turn off my video, and allow people to get their headphones. Okay. And now I am going to invite everybody to sit up straight. If you're sitting, have a nice kind of erect spine while you're sitting, and move to the edge of your seat. Okay. From there, you can take your hands, place them on your knees, and then make sure your palms are facing towards the sky. So they're very easy and just resting on your knees. And then we are going to gently close your eyes, imagining our eyelids are very heavy, like drapes being draped over a window. We're just going to hold this position now and ask ourselves, how's our body feeling right now? How did we show up? Are we feeling tense? Are we feeling anxious? Are we feeling relaxed? Just pause and take a moment to reflect. Now we are going to focus on our breath in this workshop. And the reason why we do it, why it's so powerful, is because it is the bridge between our voluntary and involuntary bodily action. It is a bridge between our consciousness as well as our subconsciousness. When we're thinking about it, we're doing it. And when we're not thinking about it, we're definitely doing it. Typically, we breathe 15 to 20 breaths a minute. Right now, we're going to lower it to 8 to 10. We are going to breathe in through our nose, out through our mouth. Now, this focus on breath, it reduces anger, anxiety, chronic pain, fatigue. The list goes on, and the solution is right under our nose. It's called a box breathing technique. We are going to have an inhale for a count of 4. We will pause for a count of 4. We will exhale for a count of 4. And then we will pause for a count of 4. We're creating a loop. We're creating that box. We're creating space with each inhale. Your chest, your rib cage will expand. We'll create the space, and then we're going to step into it. So don't worry about the counting. I'm here to help you with that. Let's try this together. In, 2, 3, 4. Pause, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. Pause, 2, 3, 4. In, 2, 3, 4. Pause, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. Pause, 2, 3, 4. In. Pause. Out. Pause. In. Pause. Out. Pause. Now on your own. In. Pause. Out. Pause. Imagine your breath as a wave. When you inhale, that crest starts. And as you pause, the wave rides smoothly through the ocean. And as you exhale, that wave gently meets the shore. Keep it going. In. Pause. Out. Pause. On your own. Pause. Now we are hitting a calm. Let's focus our thoughts within the state of consciousness. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. Simply answer it to the best of your ability, as honest as you can, and as thorough as you can to yourself. Number one, in this moment, how are you defining yourself? Who are you right now? Number two, what are your goals? What do you want from life? What are you looking for? Now think of your ideal world, your version of utopia. What does it look like? Who's in it? What are they doing? How are they treating each other? And finally, what are you doing now to make that utopia happen? How will you make this dream come to fruition? We're going to end this exercise with imagining one person that has helped you through this period right now. Take a moment to find that person. Focus on their face. Notice every dimple, every line, their lips, their nose. What color are their eyes? How are they wearing their hair today? Now imagine them smiling. Now imagine them laughing. That's your home. Now, with all your being, send them compassion, send them generosity, send them love. Now take that empathy and send it to those in your family. And now to your friends. And finally, now to everyone on this call and on this panel. Send it to anyone suffering with the disease. And finally, send it to anyone suffering because of the disease. That is all of us. We are all in this together. Now hold this moment with your breath. In, 2, 3, 4. Pause. 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4. Pause. 2, 3, 4. In. Pause. Out. Pause. All right. Everyone take one deep breath in. One big exhale out. One more time. In. Big exhale out. Gently open your eyes. The drapes are no longer covering the windows. Welcome back to your panel. Hope you enjoyed.
I have no idea how to follow up on that piece that you just gave all of us, but thank you so much, Rahul, for our mindfulness activity. We're really excited to hear more from you and others on our panel. As people are awakening and coming back to center and coming back to us, this is the moment that we've all been waiting for. And so please give a warm welcome to Denise Liu, who will be our moderator for this panel. Denise Liu will be leading the discussion and the Q&A. Denise is a retired Air Force colonel and currently employed as a healthcare consultant with Deloitte Consulting LLP. Denise, I am handing it off to you.
Thank you, Billy. So I'm Denise, and it's my honor to serve as your moderator for this evening. First, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our panelists. We'll start with Anna Gabriela Kasami. She is the founder and CEO of Novelli. Hello, Anna.
Hey, thank you for having me.
And next we have Bruce Leal. Bruce is a DC commissioner appointed by Mayor Muriel Bowser for the Commission on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs. Bruce leads the Commission's Pacific Islander Task Force and serves on the National Pacific Islander COVID-19 response team. Hello, Bruce.
Aloha. Thanks for having me.
And next we have Jill Yu. She is Managing Director and co-founder of Act to Change, one of our sponsors for this evening. Hello, Jill.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And finally, you've already met Rahul Kulkarni. He is the CEO of Suki. And thank you very much, Rahul, for that mindfulness exercise.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So we'll start off with a question for Anna. How have these recent events affected or changed how you think and feel about your racial identity?
I want to cry all the time, but seriously speaking though, I am Filipino American. I can't see the folks here who might be Filipino as well, but I'm giving you a high five. And I'm oh, Jill, sup? So I was raised by Filipino immigrants in Filipino town in LA. And you know, it's been a long journey with that, with coming to terms with the fact that I am both and I'm the hyphen in between. But with COVID-19 and the recent protests here, like LA is the site of the riots after the Rodney King trial, we have a long history of this, as well as a long history of having Asian American immigrants in this city, which I'm very proud of. I don't even know where to start to unpack that. But with my own work at Novelly, which is a civic education nonprofit, we've been doing our best to keep on top of all of these events and making sure that young people, specifically middle and high school students, are included in these conversations. And oftentimes with work like this, you start with yourself as a leader. And how can you have that conversation with a student without first understanding how these events are impacting you as well. And with COVID-19, we released this pandemics campaign and a curriculum that specifically addresses race, because we noticed that a lot of education resources weren't specifically tackling that. And it was really inspired by a conversation that I had with my sister. So my sister goes to university in the UK, and she was telling me that she was spat at on the sidewalk for supposedly bringing the Chinese virus to that town. And it was deeply upsetting, obviously, and brought me back to when I was in college, when I used to live in different countries, and remembering that I was never going to be perceived as American at that time, or maybe even now, because of the way that I looked and that I occupied space differently. So it's made me think, it's brought me back to moments when I've been told to go back to China when I was doing my grad school work in the UK, and lots of similar incidents that I think people can relate to. As for the recent protests, which we're rolling out yet another curriculum on because it's just too important to not talk about Black Lives Matter. But it's made me reflect a lot on minority communities here in the United States and how, I've often felt invisible, but for a minority group that's undoubtedly part of the fabric of America, which is the Black community, and still seeing that you can be visible, arguably like a little too visible in the public eye, and still not matter, is something that I've been thinking a lot about. But it's been a lot of intense reflection and reaching out to founders in this space, and having those tough conversations, not just with students, but with ourselves and each other.
Thank you, Anna. Now we'll go to Jill. Jill, especially with the work you do, what do you think is the best way we can reach out to others for support when we encounter a race-related incident?
That's a very loaded question. So I think I would first of all I just want to also first of all just from Anna, I just want to empathize with you. And when I heard when you were describing what happened with your sister, it kind of hit home a little bit. My work with Active Change was actually inspired or really motivated because I was also a victim of bullying and received experiencing some hate incidences. And when you experience that, you never really forget, it's always you can actually probably pinpoint and describe moment by moment of what was said, who said it to you, what you were wearing, what was the weather like. And I start that to kind of set the foundation, because I remember when I was in 5th grade, actually, back home in California. I'm from Southern California originally, even though I live in Washington, D.C. now. And in 5th grade, minding my own business, I was called by a classmate. She was, I believe she was Mexican American. She identified as such. And she just called me, "You are a stupid Jap." And I remember, and I share that incident because when I was in 5th grade, I didn't have the words nor the understanding of what that meant, but I knew it hurt. And I remember feeling hurt, and I remember crying and thinking about that. I tried to tell my teacher. Telling my teacher was, even to this day, probably one of the best advice I can give a young person. But I would also change that with tell somebody that you trust. tell your teacher, it could be your counselor, it could be your parent, could be another adult. Like if you're experiencing that, I encourage you to tell that person. I also recommend like just having a moment to allow yourself to process what that pain is. If you experience that, especially as an adult, like it's sometimes you need to just have a moment of understanding, like what did I do, or not what did I do? It's not your fault, but like what just happened. Like really think about that. If it was a hate incident as it relates to like COVID-19, like on our website, we encourage you all to report it. There's plenty of online, or you can report it anonymously through Stop AAPI Hate, or standagainsthatred.org. Like if you feel brave enough, like I would really encourage folks to report on those incidences.
Thank you, Jill. So those are all examples of bystander interventions. Do you recommend people to take bystander intervention for helping with harassment or viewing incidents of discrimination?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like one lesson like from that experience and then growing up and working, besides Act to Change, I work for the federal government. That's like actually my day job. And I'm in spaces where there are people who do not look like us. I'm in rooms where they still puzzle or they trip over my last name. Literally only 2 letters. It's you. That's it. But you have no idea how many times I've had to like correct people or like the misspelling of that one. But I do recommend definitely try finding a bystander training. Actually, Hall of Ackerall, they are offering free training, so I do recommend doing that. And the reason why is because you want to equip yourself with tools. I mentioned what happened in 5th grade, but then it connects to like what's going on as an adult for myself is because these incidences continue to happen. I took it upon myself to really learn like what I was feeling, why these things were happening, like systemically, what was going on in society, but also to really arm myself. If it was happening to me, what if it was happening to others? And then how can I properly and appropriately respond? Not only in a lens of empathy, but legally, like what is the appropriate action? Can I step in? Should I step in? How can I properly step in? Who can I legally ask for help? You know, all of that, like it only makes you a lot more prepared. And when you're prepared, if and when incidences like that happen, I feel strongly that you will be much more confident and much more courageous in how you can respond properly, as well as to help others when you do see that.
Definitely, thank you. And yeah, I've actually taken that Hollaback training for Asian American discrimination, and I know that they just started offering another course directed to the Black Lives Matter incidents now. So they do some excellent trainings. Thank you. Bruce, how can we inspire others to speak up about our experiences and effectively advocate for our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question can be interpreted in so many different ways. I think each community responds in their own way. Each leader, each individual responds in their own way and deals in their own way with these issues. But to sort of just continue off of the energy and what Jill was saying, I think the first and foremost, it's honesty that leaders, that individuals need to be honest with themselves in the spaces that they're in with others, whether they're representing others or seeking to represent others. But in touching on that point of honesty, I think it brings me back to the point Jill made earlier about just sort of those instances of bullying. And for me, so I am Native Hawaiian, Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Chamorro, but I've only really ever identified as Pacific Islander for most of my life. And there have been instances growing up in again, so my name is Bruce, last name is Leal, but I was named after Bruce Lee. My dad liked Bruce Lee. My brother's name is Lee because Bruce Lee, and then my other brother's name is Brandon because Bruce Lee had a son named Brandon. But these sort of instances of the first question here tonight was about sort of how your racial identity has sort of been impacted in any way. And for me, it's reminded me that one, I guess I am part Chinese, and so it's reminded me of that. But I remember being called like early on, I was called like a chink, and I was called like just Bruce Lee, and there were all these like stereotypes of sort of and I went to military schools, so I went to like 6 high schools, 5 middle schools, and 3 elementary schools. Military students are, in fact, I think, also a vulnerable population when you think about bullying and harassment, given the constant transitions there. But I never really, I guess, saw myself in the comments that were those instances of bullying. It hit me differently. It was almost like I developed this wall against it, and I learned to cope with it through laughing at it. And so eventually I was like, oh, you're saying that I'm like Bruce Lee and that I'm like related to Bruce Lee and all these things, and I'm going to laugh at it in this moment. And for me, it felt like, in being honest with myself, I could just sort of confront that discomfort that I felt in those moments. And so I think that it brings me to your question now about sort of what is needed to effectively advocate. I think it's the discomfort that we feel, it's the anger that we feel, because in that anger is so much just raw truth and honesty. And I think that that's the honesty that we're seeing now in these communities. When you don't respect the anger from certain communities of color, you don't respect these communities. And so I think it's important, first and foremost, to respect that discomfort that we feel within ourselves too. So I appreciate the meditation at the beginning of this, because it's making me feel a lot of discomforts. Most recently too, with the death of George Floyd, in my work with national government leaders throughout the country on racial equity, I recall there was sort of an instance last week too of a Asian government official had pointed out this article showing that I guess 2 of the officers that arrived at the scene were Asian American. Yet this individual, in seeking sort of solidarity or advice, noted that these officers were Asian Pacific Islanders. And I felt it made me feel some type of way, because Asians and Pacific Islanders are 2 distinct groups. In 1997, the Office of Management and Budget revised its Fiscal Policy Directive 15 in order to disaggregate the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, in order to further communicate the actual disparities that these communities are facing. And yet, here we are today in 2020, where that anger that was expressed in 1997 out of the Pacific Islander community rising up and saying, we as Pacific Islanders demand to be shown in the data, disaggregated, in order to allow that data to actually be meaningful for our populations. And I think for me, it was an instance of, again, being boxed into something when that issue had been supposedly dealt with previously. And so to fine tune, I guess, that point a little bit further, for me, early on, I think my bullies were the people who were sort of pointing me out as a chink and all of that, growing up. But throughout time too, even in college and even nowadays too, I think sometimes it feels like my bully is the box that sort of puts me refuses to acknowledge my identity as a Pacific Islander, and so boxes me into something which takes something away, you know. And so I think that those are just my thoughts on what I have felt I needed to be honest with in order to more effectively advocate for myself and for the Pacific Islander and Asian American community that I represents here in the district. Yeah.
It's educating others that we aren't to be lumped together in one group, but each of our identities have different experiences, right?
And Denise, if I can respond to Bruce, so that so first of all, Bruce, like I'm sorry that you ever had to experience being called that. It's just incredibly hateful is the first word that came to mind, and it made me think of like my own experience. I felt like a pang like in my chest. I'm like, oh God, like why would somebody ever say that to ourselves? But I'm glad you're sharing, because it does make me remember like why we do what we do and why spaces like this is so important. It's to share our stories, right? I mentioned earlier, like when in my day job, I don't see people who look like me or like us. But also I don't hear so many stories, or when I was growing up, I didn't hear enough stories of the type of harassment or hate that our people who look like us would endure or have endured and continue to endure. And it's important to share our stories. Disaggregating data is part of that, right? In order for us to share our stories, you need to know who we are speaking to, and we are not like this homogenous group lumped under just the Asian umbrella. But we are actually recognizing that we are boxed in, as you said, Bruce. Again, like that resonated with me, because you know who made those boxes? They weren't people like us. They were a lot lighter skinned. They're the ones who colonized the Philippines. There was a Eurocentric white supremacist attitude that kept us in those boxes. I was just thinking about like in Active Change, we had this strategy session at the start of our board, when we onboarded our new members. And we talked about like, what is the root of bullying in our communities? Bullying and hate. And it was not only a very deep and critical conversation, but it aligned and it just narrowed to the focus of it's like white supremacists, it's racism, it's the idea that we are other and we will always be that perpetual foreigner. And therefore, because of our looks, our stereotypes, or whatever else, our physical characteristics, we will be easily identified as someone that does not belong in this country. And it's I don't want to just say like it's unfair, because we already know that, but we have this this pressure, this duty in our positions of influence to really rise up and tell our stories and inspire others to also tell their stories, to attend bystander training, be ready to step in. Anyways, that was just my immediate response to Bruce. I'm like, oh, Bruce, my heart goes to you, but I'm so proud of you for speaking up and being that champion to disaggregate data. It's such a critical policy move.
Thank you, Jill, for that. So Rahul, while we're speaking up and advocating for ourselves, how do you take care of yourself physically and mentally when we're dealing with these issues?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I feel like so much of my world right now is focused on wellness, both physical wellness as well as mental wellness. And for me personally, I think the easiest thing for me is to actually have a routine spelled out. And a lot of people have that when it comes to their physical wellness. And you know, if you ask them, what do you do to keep yourself healthy, they'll tell you about their diet, or they'll tell you about how many times a week they work out, things like that. But when you're talking about mental wellness, That's something that's a little less common. And so there's a few things that I have within my own mental wellness routine. One of them, it shouldn't be a shock to anyone here, is mindfulness practice. And I always tell people, like, start small, 10 minutes twice a day. And if you don't have time for that, then you should probably double it. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but the busier you are, chances are the more likely your processor is working on overtime. Another thing that is just so easy for people to do, but they often don't do it, is having some way, whether it's verbal or written, to showcase your gratitude. Gratitude journal, just a few things every day that you're grateful for, because what you're actually doing from a neuroscientific perspective is you are training your mind to focus on the positive, versus we have inherent negativity biases in us, every one of us. And so by retraining your mind to focus on that positiveness, we're actually creating new neural pathways in our minds. And it can be really transformative in terms of how optimistic we are as a whole. I did mention exercise. That's a huge thing. My partner and I, we just started a 30-day challenge on YouTube with Yoga with Adrienne. She has been getting us through the quarantine period. Something about the way that she just doesn't take herself so seriously, but it's very manageable. And so we're on I think we're on day 12 right now. And I did it this morning because I knew I had this panel tonight. And so got that one out of the way. And I think the last thing I just want to mention is sleep is just so fundamental to kind of us as humans. And it's really easy for us to kind of be on overdrive during the week and then try to catch up on those lost REM cycles over the weekend. But we know through scientific study that that's not how our brains work. That's not how our bodies work. Once a sleep cycle has been lost, or once you've lost that sleep, you can never get it back. And so if you crash during the weekend and only sleep like 5 hours a week during the Monday through Friday, you're actually really hurting yourself as well as your sleeping rhythm. And so I always tell people, sleep 6 to 8 hours a night. And what's so important is actually go to bed and wake up around the same time every day, including on the weekends, because that's what gives yourself a natural rhythm. And so all of those are different components of my physical and mental wellness plan.
Thank you, Rahul. I admit the sleeping is something that I don't do very well myself. And one other point that I wanted to emphasize what you said about what makes you feel good is I recently learned one point where acts of kindness actually make you feel better. And I think that's such an important point, that giving actually does something for yourself, not just for the person that you're helping. So Anna, one of the things that we're focusing on now is how this is affecting our youth and children. What advice do you have for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander youth who are exploring their different identities and what they mean to them?
Yeah, definitely. Download the Nobly app. No, I'm just kidding. But low key, that is my entire job. It's to help young people or support young people on what we call a journey towards understanding the social issues that they are affected by and how it affects people differently depending on their lived experiences. And that's what we think is at the core of civics. So that's my entire life and I live and breathe it. But in terms of any advice that I have, I think something that I've been struggling with, and that it's ironic because I ask high school students to do this all the time through my work, is to have the tough conversations. And I think right now they matter more than ever. So I can even give a few examples of tough conversations I've had in the past few weeks. And I think some of the panelists have also had, like for example, having a conversation with one of my close friends about passing, and being white passing and being mixed race, and talking about like what that experience is like, and how or where it fits into this idea of race relations in America. I had another conversation that was extremely hard with my dad. So my dad lived through the LA riots, and for that reason hates this a lot, and hates what is happening so much because of the trauma that he had driving down South Central LA when he was a lot younger. So, and talking to him about Black Lives Matter and the protests has been such a challenge, but we need to have it. Talking about colorism with my grandfather within the Filipino American community, and why it is that I was told to use lightening cream when I was younger, why my grandfather's so ashamed of his brown skin. Like these are painful, and I understand what I'm asking for is a lot from all of you, but it's so important because we can't make steps towards understanding our own identities and the social issues that they're tied to without naming it, and having the courage to start those conversations with the people that we love and the people who are around us.
Thank you, Anna. Bruce, I know you mentioned some of the differences between the different Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander groups. Can you comment on what some of those differences are? What are some examples of some things that are affecting some groups more than others?
Yeah, so I don't have all the data here, but I, as a member of the National Pacific Islander COVID-19 response team, we're sort of this group, this coalition of Pacific Islander leaders from all different sectors, just coming together and trying to figure out, develop infrastructure for our Pacific Islander communities in order to address this issue. But it's the data that we've looked at so far, we've definitely noticed that COVID-19 has had a devastatingly disproportionate impact on PIs, with the highest confirmed rates rather of COVID-19 in California, King County in Washington State, Clark County in Nevada, and the second highest case rates in Utah, Oregon, Arkansas, and Colorado. And these are just in locations that are actually disaggregating the data among Asian American Pacific Islander groups. And believe it or not, there are still many jurisdictions that still group them together. And the data coming out of California is pretty staggering when it shows the disproportionate impact of Pacific Islanders. Even before the pandemic, though, the Pacific Islander community had noted very high rates of chronic diseases like diabetes, so certain cancers, heart disease, and all of these have been shown to increase the risk of disease, risk of death if they contracted COVID-19. The Kaiser Permanente also did a recent study on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, and specifically looked at Asian American communities and Pacific Islander communities. And the CDC has, there's a lot of research on this that has been, that has pointed to the social determinants of health. And I think that this is a very pressing issue for me in my role, in my work with local governments, in local jurisdictions, as we work to advance racial equity. But these are some of the challenges, and I think we don't really know to the full extent of the actual challenges that the Pacific Islander community faces in proportion to the Asian American community when the data that's coming out is not actually being disaggregated. And so I think it goes back to the initial point of just disaggregating that data so that the information that we're seeking is actually accurate and that could be produced. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Bruce. Rahul, building on that, in terms of social determinants affecting our communities, can you comment on especially how it affects work, especially as it's affected our population of essential workers, especially during the height of the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, as Bruce brought up the idea of social determinants of health, it got me thinking of kind of where we started this panel in my presentation, because I was like, oh wait, those were the things that were the factors of why we are experiencing that collective grief, like economic stability, people's education, their neighborhoods that they're growing in, all of these different social determinants of health, they're all being affected right now. And so on a personal level, as well as on a community level and a systemic level, they're all being, like, kind of those disparities that we normally see, they're very much so being exacerbated right now. And to also kind of just build on what Bruce was saying about Asians not being a monolith, I think that's really true as well when we are looking at the mortality rates and the morbidity rates of minorities as a whole, and looking at how different cultures are being affected by the pandemic. And I was trying to think to myself, like, well, what are some of the drivers that are causing those disparities? And so some of them that I thought of was, well, okay, you have different cultural groups doing different types of jobs. And so that type of employment, some are more prone to service jobs or doing delivery work, working in grocery stores. They're having more contact with people. The other is just access to care. While certain cultures or racial groups might have are more likely to be insured and have health care, while others might be less likely to have health insurance. And finally, even if you do get into the gate and you're part of the medical healthcare system, how that medical community treats you, that is certainly something that also is very different based on how you look. And we've seen different rates of people getting tested, how they're listening to patients, and that ultimately is affecting their morbidity as well as their mortality rates. And so those are all kind of those social determinants, I think, play such a huge factor. And I really like this idea of not treating kind of broad strokes on data categories here, or which are people categories. And to answer your other question, how that relates to work, it's been a huge change for us that we've seen. Just, for me, having a startup that's kind of was really trying to find itself beforehand and trying to get our initial customers, we went from having mental health and cultural sensitivity be very much a nice to have for a lot of anytime we ever made a pitch to a company and to an employer. And from then the pandemic hit, and we went from having one client to 20 clients in a couple months. It was just such a mental shift in the emotional wellness of their employees, especially as everyone was forced to work from home. And now they're juggling things like childcare, teaching their students, the ambiguity and uncertainty of the pandemic, all of that happening at once. Suddenly, the mental wellness and level of stress of their employees was no longer just a nice to have. It was critical to how these employers operate. And so I think there are some major shifts happening right now in terms of the role of work, as well as how do we deal with the stress of working through a period where there's a lot of other things happening in the background as well.
Okay, thank you, Rahul. Okay, we're going to get into this last question for all of the panelists. And in the meantime, our audience can start populating the quick Q&A with any of the questions that they want to address to the panelists after we finish this final question. I would like to ask each of our panelists, what gives you hope, especially in light of all of the participation in this past week in the protests and everyone looking out for each other and so many different people participating in the protests? What gives you hope going forward? And anybody can start. You want to start, Anna?
Yeah, sure. I can go ahead and get started. I feel super lucky that I get to come into work every day. I mean, granted though, it's now over Zoom, and see how middle, high school, and college students across this country are processing these issues in profound and thoughtful ways. I have a specific thing that gave me hope, which is we have this youth writing competition, and we have one every semester, and we had one on COVID-19 and race. And if I could, I would love to read an excerpt from my favorite poem that came out of it, called Year of the Rat by Alyssa. She would do this much more justice than I would. So if you do want to see her read this poem for herself, you can go on our Instagram, but I will read it for this webinar. And this is just a small excerpt, and it's much longer. And this doesn't do it justice, but I still wanted to share it. Okay. President Trump calls it the China virus, crosses out the corona in his speech, and substitutes it for the color of my skin. It chases me like a stray dog, saliva dripping from a foaming mouth, nails scraping against rough asphalt. The stray dog curls around the heels of a girl in my film class. She says, "Chinese people are disgusting," says we will eat just about anything, calls us dirty dog eaters and pathogen carriers. We have worn these names like cotton masks that cover our mouths and muffle our words, as if we aren't used to being silenced by white already, as if we are presumed to be diseased before we can speak. So that's a small taste of Alyssa's poem called Year of the Rat, which we are publishing officially through our platforms. But I just wanted to share that this gives me such profound hope, because it shows me that young people are using their voices. They are aware of what's happening and are processing it accordingly, and that people are listening. We just had to give them a platform. So that's been getting me through the day and making me feel just excited and hopeful that, you know, we're gonna get through this and come out better for it.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Anna. Bruce.
So yeah, I echo similar sentiments. I think for me, in my work with local jurisdictions, working with local leaders in the national capital region, there have been just these amazing efforts to advance racial equity in a more systematic way. And it's really been astounding, the progress that has been made. Certain jurisdictions are addressing homelessness and affordable housing issues. And other jurisdictions are focusing on language access, especially during COVID-19. All of these issues are injected with equity into them, and I think it makes just everything all the more meaningful. But I think what gives me hope is that these conversations are beginning to become normalized, that it's sort of becoming a part of the new normal in a way, in the sense of this discomfort that we feel, we are learning to settle with it, and we are learning to deal with it, and that is being utmost in center. There's no way to deny it. And that, I feel, is very hopeful, but also being able to see and be part of these local jurisdictions, these local and state efforts to operationalize policies and practices to advance racial equity, to solve these issues which are systemic, and to Jill's point earlier, at the root of it's bullying and discrimination is racism, and to see these jurisdictions calling out racism for what it is, but also declaring racism to be a public health crisis, acknowledging the fact that racism does in fact affect people's health negatively, and these spotlights in, one, these conversations being normalized, two, these policies that are being operationalized, and three, the organizing that is happening on the ground, I think is astounding. That is, for me, what gives me hope.
Thank you, Bruce. Jill, what gives you hope?
These types of conversations, I'll be honest. I think like one thing that came to mind. So first of all, I want to give a shout out to a fellow co-board member who is attending and giving me the support all the way from the West Coast. I feel it, Richard. I see you, and I appreciate you and grateful that you're on the board with me. And I think that's actually a perfect example of what hope looks like to me. Amidst all the chaos, the protests, the hate, the hurt that was going on all last week through all entire COVID-19, I struggled to find comfort in the mess, to be quite honest. I struggled to find like who can really understand like what I was going through. And I was like thinking of Rahul, like I actually like went inward, and I didn't know that I was grieving. I didn't know that I was reacting to what was going on in the world in such a way. I was just kind of like bearing it down, and so that I can thrive and survive the next day. And last week, I won't go into full details, but I did suffer like a personal passing of someone really, really close to me in my life. And it was I needed a moment to grieve and take a pause from the weight of the work. And my community, my board, my friends allowed me to do that. So when I came back to the board, ready to pick up and help out, the work was continuing, and that gave me so much hope. It was one of those moments where I thought, I'm letting the movement down. Not to say the movement's all on my shoulders, but I wanted to contribute, and I felt like I let my board down. I let my friends down because I needed a moment to myself. And when I saw that the work was continuing, they were still organizing events, they were still having like these critical conversations. And when I came back, they welcomed me with open arms, without any judgment, without any question. It was like those kinds of moments that I'm like, you know what, when we're feeling down, when you can find your community, when you can find your tribe, they can really lift you up, and they can give you that understanding and that space for you to process. And we can't do this work alone. Like, you can't share that burden by yourself. So when you're able to find that group who can really carry that workload with you, lean on them, take the break, take the moment, do what Rahul said, read a couple of books or articles on Novelly. I just downloaded it, Anna, just for a shout out for you. Do what you need to recover, and then go back to your community and your tribe, and rejuvenate yourself to continue the movement. The work still needs to be done, but really it doesn't have to be just you leading that effort.
Thank you, Jill. Rahul, what gives you hope?
Yeah, a lot. And I just want to say to Jill, I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm happy to see you feeling better. And I've been going to a lot of kind of talks about self-care and self-compassion, and just time and time after again, it's just been shown that the better you take care of yourself, actually, the more impactful your work is towards others. And so it's certainly something. It's not a selfish thing. It's both selfish and selfless. Because you show up better, you do better work, and it doesn't matter if it's parenting or or doing activism or anything like that. It's just taking space and time is so crucial. So I'm glad you had an opportunity to do that. And in terms of what gives me hope, there's a lot. One of the things is so this is not new, right? The fact that there's these racial injustices, especially against the Black community and our police brutality, and it's been happening time and time after again. But I think the reason why this time is so much more critical than any other time that it's happened, at least in my lifetime, is that because we were forced to be inside prior, right? We were forced to pause, to put all of our lives on hold, to have that shared vulnerability, that shared empathy. And then suddenly we were all shown those videos. We were all shown these images, and the response was explosive. There are people now in the BLM movement, myself included, that was never before like an activist for the BLM movement, right? This is now not just a Black community issue. This is an everybody issue. And I think because we had that space to kind of, be by ourselves and then think about what kind of world do we want to return to after the pandemic. And so just not only seeing the level of response, but also seeing the level of action, like impact this is actually having. Like there's been sweeping reform in like 10 days, whether it's defunding of police departments, bills being proposed now to completely revamp how we're training police. Like huge changes are happening right now, to the point where it's like, it's not just the body cam anymore. This is going to change the way policing happens in our society. And so I'm very hopeful for that, because I think that that's been very necessary for a while. And another thing, and I don't know if there's any rules about getting political or not, but I'm super happy that like Trump just looks worse and worse every day. And before this, I was pretty sure he was going to win again. And now I'm not so sure anymore. I'm like, he's looking pretty bad. And so hopeful for that as well.
Thank you, Rahul. So we have a question, and I know that we had talked amongst us a little bit about this, but it has to do with how do we as Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders deal with our own implicit or unconscious biases and avoid being complicit in the Black Lives Matter. Does anyone want to address that? Jill?
I think, yeah, I'm happy to start with, so first of all, that's very brave of you to ask that question, because I do think it starts with yourself, right? It starts with having a self-awareness of what are your own beliefs, what your cultural upbringing has influenced you to, and how that has shaped your lens, your perspective of the world. And there's also, I think like when I was confronting my own implicit bias, gender, race, all of the above, like everything, there was this initial feeling of shame, right? I was embarrassed, I was humiliated. I'm supposed to be, is this still cool? Everyone's saying the word woke. I don't know, I'm so old. But anyways, like being like aware of like what's going on. And I used to be a very young activist in college, and I thought I had prepared myself to be inclusive and confront these diverse these issues. And then when I was confronted with my own implicit biases against anything, again, I like went internal. I was like, oh my God, I'm so ashamed. Like I'm a fraud. Like I do think like it first starts with recognizing what you are feeling, like what your belief in, and then digging deep, like what led you to that belief. Educate yourself, educate like do the research, you know. I know there's a lot of like the interns here in this group who are incredibly motivated. There are so many resources at your fingertips for you to just unlearn what you were taught and indoctrinated in school and through our upbringing. So that's one piece, like really just understanding your self-awareness and then trying to find and unlearn it. I do think like culturally though, it's when I think of implicit biases too, I think about like our family, the generations, our aunties, our uncles who are very proud to just assert like we are not them, like they're just asserting like these racist comments and they think it's okay and it's normal. I think it's also like being willing to acknowledge like where that kind of ideas are coming from and empathize with them. And if appropriate and respectful, I don't know your family situation and a friend situation, but be willing to have a sensitive and empathetic conversation to challenge it. That's really only the way to have change, like if you're able to engage in a discussion, but no pressure. I'm not like asking you to like, go and I have a 92-year-old grandma. If I start talking about this stuff, I don't know what will happen. So I can't I have to be appropriate, make it, introduce it slowly, but it does start with yourself.
And we also had a question that had to do with what maybe we struggle with that maybe today's youth are capable of addressing or starting to address already. Maybe there's a generational difference.
Oh, yeah, and I welcome that question. I don't know, sorry, I'm gonna also throw it to Anna also because of your thing, tag you all in. But it's interesting, like with like the youth population, there's so many resources available to you, especially like social media. And I'm always like in awe and impressed by the creative ideas that the younger generation comes up with. And I just, and again, I use this word courage. When I was younger, I was not very as assertive. I was not willing to put myself out there to talk about like me being called a stupid Jap or like the embarrassment I felt. I was told, don't rock the boat, just like put your head down and study and just, go on. But with the new youth, our youth, I would just encourage you to really like channel those resources, figure out ways to tell your story so that others who look like you can hear and also feel like I'm being heard as somebody else has gone through an experience with me, and you can connect with them through those avenues. It doesn't have to be in person, virtually now. Social media allows for that platform. So, and third to Anna.
Thanks, Jill, for passing the ball. So I am really excited about political participation among AANHPI youth, and I am so excited to see them, become Congress members, be commissioners, become part of local governments, at all levels. I'm just really excited because I think, and I know that it's a diverse group and a diverse political voice, and I only speak for my own experience, but I know that my parents were just trying to put their heads down, accumulate some wealth, get by, try not to get too much racism thrown their way. Like they were not thinking about running for office. And I think that the time is now. I am still waiting for a Filipina Congress member to take office after over 150 years of being in this country. So I believe in you. If that's you, go for it. Please do it for me, for everyone. And yeah, I think this generation won't be hindered by feeling as limited as maybe our parents and our grandparents did in terms of like having a political voice in this country.
Thank you both, Jill and Anna. We have had another question having to do with how we keep up the momentum after quarantine ends. Well, we don't know how long it's going to take until this and especially if we get a second wave, but how do we keep this momentum up after and continue our activism?
I can take a stab. And the short answer is I don't know. that's a hard thing to figure out. How do you keep people motivated? But I will say that it doesn't, just from the preliminary data of places opening up and then the spikes happening again globally, this is not a problem that's going to be solved very quickly. And also the amount of time it's going to take to produce a vaccine, mass produce it, and then disseminate it. We are not going to have herd immunity on COVID-19 for a long time. And so I think there is going to be a slow transition, and I don't even think we're going to transition back to what we were. Like right now, the norms of work have changed. What it means to work from home has changed. To be part of a team or remote team has changed. And like these were all trends that were already happening. They've just all been accelerated. So I don't necessarily think it'll slow down because there's a cure now and COVID's not in our mindset. I also think the fact that this is an election year is that alone is going to be driving things till the end of the year. And so I don't think this is just a summer thing. I think this is going to lead all the way into the end of into 2021. And then what the world will look like then, it's hard to say, but I think it'll certainly look different regardless.
And how about what do we do if we feel that there's a setback? Like we've been trying really hard, nothing happens. How do we keep motivated after that to keep fighting?
I can try to take a stab at this.
Okay.
And I'm going to throw it to Bruce coming out. I'm just tagging my panelists and why not? We're all friends now. So I think oftentimes it's when you're doing this type of work, especially like community organizing, or you're trying to make, you're just really passionate around an issue, it's very hard to see any products, any outcome, any deliverable from all the labor and all the hours that you spent just trying to promote, trying to educate others. You know, they always say like for the civil rights movement, it's a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. Like you need to like really plan the long game. But what helps me is to remember what the vision of the world should look like to me. And I point to like my board, like to act to change, and I'll read it quickly. But so our vision of the world is we envision a world where all youth, including within the AAPI community, have the opportunity to grow up feeling proud and supported in the development of their identity and sharing their stories. So our board, Act to Change, continues to empower students by advocating for systemic change and providing resources to promote healthy communities. And I look to that often because sometimes the work gets very exhausting, and sometimes I don't know if we are even making a dent in a change. But when I think about if I'm feeling tired and I'm feeling lost, I think about actually to Rahul's meditation, like what is the vision? What is this utopia society that we're trying to achieve? And then kind of chisel away, like do day by day, one thing at a time. How is that effort going to contribute to the overall vision that I hope to see in this world?
So piggybacking off of that, in terms of, I guess, dealing with setbacks, for me, I find myself to be, I study philosophy and psychology, but I would say that I am a Stoic. And there's one sort of quote, I think, by Marcus Aurelius that said that, I believe it's Marcus Aurelius, that the impediment to action becomes the action. What stands in the way becomes the way. For me, I find that that is a truth that I constantly try to just circle around, because there's just been so many instances that have brought me down and that have continued, that systemic policies and practices that continue to bring down communities. And I find that leaning into those discomforts for me, calling out the discrimination that I see, the biases that I see in the spaces that I enter, and being extremely honest with myself and with others about that, I find that that has become sort of my tool in terms of discomfort is sort of that go-to now when there's a setback. It's like press the discomfort button, lean into it, and think a little bit more critically about that. For myself, I find that that allows me to think more critically about my own identity, and I find that my culture is just one of the, I never saw it as a strength. And so I really went to college. I never really, I guess, identified as APIA or engaged in any of the issues prior to really high school, but it was in going to George Washington University, being surrounded by so much power and privilege in the seat of our nation's government, that I recognized just my Indigenous identity. And so it was in being a colonial, the mascots of GW, that I discovered my Indigenous identity. It was sort of that unlayering of my identity that I think it was just a lot of discomfort that I felt. And so I jumped into spoken word. I joined the DC Slam team, leading with that discomfort. And now I think leading with that identity, that has allowed me to sort of think back about like some of those setbacks. I'm also a former special educator. And so when I engage in issues, really, I find that almost everything is tied back to education. And I find that the students that I taught in the classrooms, both in DC and in Hawaii, special education students from elementary, middle, and high school, I find that those stories empower me. And the stories of just my community and my ancestors, I find is a sort of collective strength. So to Joe's point earlier, the elements of togetherness, I think, is key in those situations.
Thank you. There was a question. I think the point the person wanted to ask is, how do we balance between aggregating our activism and power together, but still doing justice to pointing out the differences in the disparities among the different Asian groups?
So I mean, I want to say that at its basic level, it's data disaggregation. It's separate. It's, you know, give the accurate data so that it could actually inform more equitable outcomes. But I think at the root of that, and I think that I appreciate this conversation because it gets to the root of these issues, which is in itself racism and structural racism. And as Joe pointed to earlier, the boxes that we were sort of put into, I still grapple with that. I don't have the answers to you know, any of the issues, but I think that I deal with this in the best way that I know how, and that's by just sort of, I think, respecting the anger that is in these spaces, because I think the most important thing to do is obviously to listen. And if you're really listening, I think you feel and you hear the anger. And I think it's important not just to hear that and to acknowledge it, but to respect it. I think that there's just, at its core, every movement is built on respect. And so I think that is key here. And I don't know if that answers the question, but one of the points that, you know, this National Coalition of Pacific Islanders have, we are calling for is for federal compliance with OMB 15, the Office of Management and Budget Policy, which was revised in 1997 to disaggregate this data. Again, this has been a long-standing issue that has been called out and has been supposedly addressed, but that is the anger in the 1990s that was expressed, that is being expressed again today, I think, as among the Pacific Islander communities. And so as allies, I think it's important to just work together with them on that. Yeah.
I wanted to add on to that. And also, I was the CAPAL scholar as well, and I cannot tell you how much hours we spent talking about data disaggregation as a cohort. Like that word, oh my God, like it was just in my mind forever. But I was watching this episode of the Patriot Act. I don't know if folks have been watching Hassan Minhaj's Patriot Act, and he did an episode on, you know, the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community being in solidarity with the Black community. And I love the way he said that Martin Luther King Jr., when all of the civil rights acts were getting passed, he CC'd us, the children of immigrants, through the Immigration Act, which was also passed during that time. And I think, you know, at the risk of oversimplifying what should be a much longer conversation, I think as, you know, this political bloc and voice that is very diverse, we need to CC each other on those emails, y'all. Like if you're a Filipina congresswoman, Congress member, being educated on like what the Sikh community is experiencing, and all of like the, you know, the bullying within that group because they wear turbans and are very much misidentified. Not that targeting and bullying is right either. So like when you have political power as a subgroup within this, CCing all of your fellow AANHPI folks onto those political activities and civic activities that you're doing.
Thank you, Anna. So we had an interesting question that Billy actually posted in the chat. And we want to ask how people felt about Andrew Yang, who had an editorial in the Washington Post about asking Asian Americans to demonstrate their, quote, Americanness in response to anti-Asian discrimination. How does the panelists feel about this call to action?
I could start this one. And I assume Andrew Yang he's the Yang Gang guy. Is that him?
Yes.
Got it. Yeah. Well, I definitely don't like him. I like him less now as a candidate. That's for sure. I think it's terrible. I couldn't even imagine anyone running for president who would actually have that advice. You know, part of what makes America or the United States what it is that it is, you know, it's always been maybe not a haven, but a destination for immigration. And so having your civil liberties to dress however you want to dress, regardless of the political climate or regardless of what the social climate is, to me, that itself is very much fundamental to being an American. Just like your ability to protest, especially peacefully, is part of your fundamental ability to say what you want, wear what you want. That is such a huge part of the individualism that creates this culture. And to tell people to assimilate in a way that doesn't feel authentic because it might invite less hatred towards you, to me that is the equivalent of whitening your face, right? that to me, you know, is very poor advice.
And I'll jump in here. So first of all, I thank you for that question, because it represents like Andrew Yang's article, because of his position of running for, a presidential candidate. Like his words have influence. But I don't want to give value to his words. And this is me just speaking from Jill, not necessarily like my board. I think what frustrates me most about hearing what that article was implying is there is one monolithic type of Americanness, and we need to force ourselves. And that Americanness is the box that that Bruce mentioned earlier. It's forcing, we need to fit this mold that the model minority mold per se. And it also reminds me of growing up where my parents wanted me to fit in that mold because they did not want us to rock the boat. They didn't want us to cause ripples. They didn't want us to bring attention to our family and the fact that we were different. There's nothing wrong with being different, first of all, but second of all, like I don't need to justify me being American. I am American, and I don't need to change my authentic self, as Rahul mentioned, so that others will feel more comfortable with who I am and how I present myself. That's not leadership to me. That's not a good advice on like what we should be pushing out there to our youth and to the generations that come after us. And one thing, I'll get off my high horse in a second, but like one thing that frustrates me is that is Andrew Yang also is speaking from a position of privilege, right? He has this ability where he was able to kind of like straddle like the privilege that came with a model minority myth. And you know that because he would wear that pin that says math on it. And maybe he was good at math, I don't know, but I know that he was also very like playing to the part of I am Asian American and we're stereotypically good at math. And so therefore I am therefore smart and I am not a threat. It was insulting, right? Like I worked so hard to demystify what this model minority is, because it overlooks so many of the other issues that are affecting our communities. So him, like just this idea of Americanness, I completely agree with Rahul. I'm against the Yang Gang, to be quite honest, but it's also like something for us to think about too. Like this is what's out there in popular culture, the need to be Americanness, and that these are the types of conversations we need to challenge ourselves and others. Like, what is really Americanness? How do we belong? I already belong. What, just engaging those types of critical discussions.
I would love to, I don't know if we have enough time, Denise.
Sure.
Or if
From you too, Anna.
I feel very strongly about this because, as Jill and Rahul have mentioned, it just also doesn't work, like Danny Chen, if you remember, like he was in the military, he was, born and raised in New York City, and still you can experience racism because of what you look like and how people perceive you. So it's just false. And on top of that, I think it's really beautiful that there are many ways to be American. Like my grandmother never learned English, lived in the US for 30 years of her life, but was a rabid Lakers fan and a business owner, an active member of her community, didn't speak a word of English. And I think it's really beautiful that, to me, she is American, and I would challenge anyone who argued otherwise. So yeah, it's just, if it's not going to be true anyway, and it's not going to prevent racism, we might as well actually address the root problem, which is the racism, and not put the burden on members of our community to solve that and figure that out.
Thank you. Well, I want to express my gratitude to these excellent panel members for their answers and for all of their thoughtful insights to share with this group tonight. And I will turn it back over to Billy.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Denise, Anna, Bruce, Jill, Rahul, for your thoughtful conversation this evening. thank you to everyone for joining us today. Before you log off, there are a few important pieces of information I'd like to mention. So just give me 3 minutes, and then Bruce will be sending us off into the night with a Hawaiian prayer. And so first thing is, please don't miss our upcoming events. Next Wednesday, we have our second WLP session. So if you learned from this, if you gained from this, if there's something you can take from this, come to our next session. It's entitled Democracy 2020, Making It Work, where we'll discuss the critical importance of civic engagement, as we have been sort of touching on now, in the AANHPI community, and the challenges and barriers to greater civic engagement, and all of the different ways that members of our community can get involved even further in defending and uplifting our democracy. Key topics of discussion will include the power of voting, the importance of the 2020 census. Please fill it out if you haven't filled it out yet, as well as other avenues of civic engagement, including a career in public service. Also, please check out our website and on how to register and to view all of our upcoming programming. You can find us at CAPAL.org. Please follow us on Facebook and Twitter at CAPALDC. That's all it is. It's the @ CAPALDC. And then also find us on LinkedIn and join our network of folks who are connected to us and want to continue supporting us. For a little bit of background, which is essential, CAPAL initially started as an all volunteer organization, just volunteers. That was about 30 years ago. And CAPAL has since served more than 600 scholars and interns, has awarded over $360,000 to support public service careers for both undergraduates and graduate students. Our board members, scholars, and interns have gone on to serve as senior leaders across government, from the executive to the legislative to the judicial branches to federal, state, and local levels. We're doing it all. And so, as well as prominent policy and advocacy organizations. And so, your valued financial contributions help expand this work. It is needed. It is encouraged. Please donate. You can do that at CAPAL.org. We also ask that you please spread the word about our scholarship and internship program. Opportunities for undergraduates and graduate students are open every year in November. And also consider if there are any AANHPI students you know or organizations who we should link up with or partner with. Even telling your university career center about us will help us get more of our opportunities out to folks like us who need it. And lastly, if your organization is interested in sponsoring us, you can contact our managing director, Shama Ahmed. You can find our contact info on the website for sponsorship opportunities. Finally, we're always trying to improve our programming to meet the needs and expectations of our community. And so after you log off, please hold on 1 second. There will be a short survey that should take you no more than 2 or 3 minutes to complete. Your honest feedback will be extremely valuable to improving our future programming and really just giving you a stake in how we evolve and continue to serve you and the rest of the community. And so, thank you so much, everyone. Good night. And Bruce, this is your cue. Take it away.
Thanks. I wasn't super prepared for this, but there is proper protocol here. So the prayer here is Ho'oponopono. It's an ancient Hawaiian prayer, and it's been revisited many times. Loosely translated, Ho'oponopono means to make it right. As a sort of reconciliation prayer, you think of, when you recite this prayer, you think of others, you think of yourself. It's sort of rooted in the ancient Hawaiian psychology, where there are these 3 different minds, and I'll just briefly go over them. But the first is the Aumakua, right, the father, and we think of this as the higher consciousness. The second is the Unihipili, the child, and we think of this as the unconscious mind. And then lastly, there is Uhane, which is the conscious mind, and we think of this as the mother. And so the key words in this prayer are the following 4 phrases. I'm sorry, I love you, please forgive me, thank you. These 4 phrases, we say them and we think of ourselves. When we say them, we think of the loved ones that are past and present. We think of enemies and friends. And so I'm going to sort of take one from Raul's book here and go off a video for a second, sort of tune in here. The prayer is usually recited 3 times. I will just recite it once here. But again, the 3 key words here are, I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you. Divine Father, Mother, and Son as one, we give fragrant flowers at the feet of your soul. We bow to you and wish for you a life that is whole, full of wellness, peace, and grace, your eternal self shining from your face. Ho'oponopono, ho'oponopono, ho'oponopono. To loved ones, past and present, to both enemies and friends, we pray to our collective selves that we may make amends, release all encumbrances, and forgive into spaciousness. We breathe Tonglen to all in mind and heart of graciousness. Ho'oponopono, ho'oponopono, ho'oponopono. We love you. We're sorry. Please forgive us. Thank you. And it is done. And that is the Ho'oponopono prayer briefly. But thank you for allowing me to share that.